I'm Claire Whitman, 33 years old, and tonight I'm parked outside the same brick colonial where I grew up. My father's 60th birthday party is in full swing, inside laughter spilling through the windows, but I'm still sitting in my car. My hands rest on the steering wheel, steady on the surface, though my pulse beats hard in my ears. For most of my life, my father has seen me as the family's afterthought, never the one with real promise. Tonight, for the first time, he's about to hear the truth about what I've built, and it will change the way he sees me forever. Inside old photographs line the walls, but what I have to share will never fit inside a frame. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who doubted you. I grew up in Wellesley, Massachusetts, a quiet suburb with wide streets, trimmed hedges, and a rhythm that revolved around school schedules and neighborhood events. Our home was modest compared to some of the grander houses nearby, but my father Richard took pride in its polished look and the fact that it stood as a testament to his career as an economics professor. My mother Margaret had once filled her days with painting and teaching art, but over time her brushes stayed in their jars while she supported my father's ambitions. By the time I was in elementary school, her studio had been turned into storage, and our family conversations revolved almost entirely around my father's lectures publications and my brother Daniel's achievements. Daniel was 2 years older and excelled without appearing to try. Test scores, debate trophies, scholarship offers, they all seemed to fall into his lap. My father beamed with each of his successes, filling shelves and walls with proof. I learned early that my own strengths didn't earn the same praise. While Daniel could memorize formulas and win over judges with carefully crafted arguments, I was better at reading people solving problems that weren't in the textbook and spotting patterns in everyday life. Those things didn't make it into the family photo albums. I can still see the moment it began to sting the first day of 4th grade, carrying home my best math grade, yet a hard-earned B+ after months of tutoring. I had pictured my father smiling the way he did for Daniel. Instead, he nodded vaguely and turned to admire Daniel's perfect score on the same test. That evening, as they talked about strategies for the next competition, my mother squeezed my hand under the table, her silent way of saying she saw me. It was comforting, but it didn't erase the truth that was settling deep inside in our house. One kind of talent counted, and I didn't have it. Through middle school and into high school, I discovered I had an eye for markets. I read the business section of the newspaper when no one was looking, tracking companies and imagining where they might go next. But in the Whitman family, economics was something my father taught, and Daniel was expected to master. My ideas were treated as guesses, my wins as luck. Still, I kept learning in my own way, building knowledge no one else seemed to notice. By the time college decisions came, Daniel had his pick of the Ivy League. I applied to several schools, including my father's alma mater, hoping my grades in economics and my competition wins might finally be enough. When the rejection letter arrived, my father didn't soften the blow. He called my backup choice the state university that had offered me a partial scholarship, a place that accepted anyone with a pulse. That night, I realized his opinion of me might never change. That summer before college, I took a teller job at a neighborhood bank to cover the costs my father refused to help with. The days moved in a steady rhythm, unlocking the doors each morning, counting the cash drawers, greeting regulars who knew one another by name. Mrs. Jenkins, our branch manager, was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who could spot a counterfeit bill from across the counter. She noticed early on that I kept a stack of financial magazines at my station reading during slow moments instead of scrolling through my phone. One quiet Thursday afternoon, she leaned against my counter and asked if I'd ever thought about working in finance. I told her I planned to study business, but her nod told me she saw something more in the way I watched numbers move. By the end of the summer, she was teaching me how to read loan agreements and explaining why certain customers always seemed to leave the bank smiling. When August came, my mother pressed an envelope into my hand the night before I left. She didn't say much, just that she believed in me, but inside was nearly her entire savings. It was more than I expected, and more than I wanted her to give, but she didn't let me refuse. I carried it with me onto campus that fall, a reminder that at least one person in my family trusted my potential. Arriving at State University was like stepping onto a blank page. The campus sprawled across old brick walkways shaded by maples and oaks, the kind of place where students lounged on the grass between classes. No one here knew about the dinner table comparisons, the grades that were never good enough, or the way my father could turn praise into dismissal in a single breath. My roommate Jasmine was a communications major with hair dyed a deep aubergine, and she made friends as easily as breathing. She didn't flinch when I told her I was working 3 jobs to afford school. "Then you'll appreciate it more," she said one night over takeout, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. My mornings started in the campus library shelving books before the first lecture of the day. Evenings were spent at a diner off Main Street, taking orders from students and professors alike. On weekends, I worked remotely as a virtual assistant for an investment blog, drafting reports and updating spreadsheets. Every spare dollar went toward tuition books or a modest investment account I'd been growing since high school. In my first finance class, I met Professor Diana Carson. She had once been a senior analyst on Wall Street, the kind of job my father would have respected if he'd believed I could ever get there. She didn't just teach from the textbook. She brought real-world cases, walking us through the decisions behind the headlines. One afternoon, after I challenged a point in her lecture with 3 recent examples that told a different story, she asked me to stay behind. She told me most students accepted her word without question, but I had dug deeper. That conversation turned into a mentorship that lasted the rest of my time in college. While others analyzed only the financial statements of a company, I learned to layer in social trends, new technology adoption, and the subtle ways culture shifts could affect a market. My first significant investment, $2,000, saved from my campus jobs, went into a small tech startup focused on social media analytics. The firm wasn't on anyone's radar, but the patterns I'd been watching convinced me it was ready to break out. 8 months later, the stock had tripled, paying my tuition for the next semester. By the time I graduated, my portfolio had grown to $50,000. Professor Carson recommended me for an internship at a respected regional investment firm. There I met Leslie Montgomery, a senior analyst who had fought her way up in the male-dominated finance world of the 80s and 90s. She told me early on that I'd have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and asked if I was prepared for that. I told her I'd been preparing my whole life. Leslie became my guide in the practical side of finance, not just the numbers, but how to earn trust in boardrooms where no one expected you to belong. She introduced me to clients, showed me how to navigate the politics of firm life, and insisted I sit in on meetings I hadn't been invited to just so I could learn. Graduation came with highest honors in finance, though my father's reaction was as restrained as ever. At the celebration dinner, he told me that while state school honors were nice, they weren't the same as graduating from the Ivy League. Daniel, now in law school, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. I didn't bother to mention that I'd already accepted a position at a top firm in New York. I left home with 2 things that mattered: my $50,000 portfolio and Leslie's letter of recommendation. My first apartment in Brooklyn was a narrow studio with a shower so small I had to keep my elbows tucked in. The commute into Manhattan was long, but walking into the glass towers each morning felt like entering the center of the world. As a junior analyst, I worked alongside 20 other new hires, most from elite universities. They spoke about internships with family friends and connections I couldn't imagine having. At first, they barely noticed me. But when we were assigned to prepare recommendations for an upcoming pitch, I spotted something in the data, a mid-tier social media platform that was gaining unexpected traction among new demographics. My analysis showed it was on the edge of rapid growth, but the department head brushed it off as too risky. The firm went with the safer picks. That night, I used $10,000 of my own money to buy shares in the company they rejected. 6 months later, after several major partnerships were announced, the stock's value had more than tripled. I didn't mention my gain to anyone at the firm, but I started keeping 2 sets of recommendations, one for them, one for me. The shift came when Garrett Thompson, a senior partner managing high net worth accounts, overheard me discussing a market trend in the break room. He asked for my input on a few client portfolios. When my predictions proved right again and again, he brought me onto his team. At 26, I became the youngest senior analyst at the firm. The promotion brought a better apartment, a larger personal portfolio, and a growing list of clients who valued my unconventional approach. By 28, I'd crossed the $1 million mark in personal wealth and was managing some of the firm's most important accounts. But every trip home was the same, my father introducing me as our daughter who works in New York before launching into Daniel's latest case. I kept my real accomplishments to myself. The decision to strike out on my own came quietly without a dramatic turning point. I had built the skills, the network, and the capital. I knew it was time. With $800,000 of my own money, I launched Whitman Capital, a boutique firm focused on finding opportunities others overlooked. The first year tested every bit of grit I had 18-hour days sleeping in the office, convincing wary clients to take a chance. But I knew that if I could land one big win, the rest would follow. Landing my first major client was nothing like I'd imagined. It happened in a quiet meeting room with plain walls and a table that could seat 12. Nathan Blackwell, a tech entrepreneur in his early 40s, had just sold his company for $30 million and wanted someone new to handle his investments. He told me he'd read an article that mentioned my ability to spot patterns others missed. "The old guard is stuck on what worked yesterday," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I want someone who can see what will work tomorrow." I walked him through my approach, explaining how I combined market data with technology trends and social behavior shifts. By the end of the hour, he slid a folder across the table with documents authorizing me to manage $5 million of his money. In the months that followed, his portfolio grew by 60%. It was the break I needed. Word of his return spread quickly, and suddenly, the phone in my small office rang more often. Referrals came from unexpected places: a venture capitalist in San Francisco, a real estate developer in Dallas, a retired athlete looking to invest outside of sports. I hired 2 junior analysts and trained them in my method, insisting they understand that every number told a story about people, not just markets. By my 31st birthday, Whitman Capital managed over $500 million in assets. That year, the Wall Street Journal ran a feature calling me the social oracle of Wall Street. They sent a photographer to capture me in my corner office Manhattan skyline in the background. The picture made the rounds in the industry, and soon after Forbes called asking for an interview. I kept a copy of each article in a drawer at my desk, but I never mailed them home. My parents knew I owned a firm. They didn't know the scale of it. When I visited Wellesley for Christmas, my father still introduced me as our daughter, who works in New York, and quickly shifted the conversation to Daniel's law cases. I didn't correct him. I wore understated clothes, rented a modest car for the week, and kept my answers vague. It wasn't about hiding my life. It was about avoiding the tired routine of him questioning my choices or diminishing my work. That distance became its own habit, one I didn't break until the invitation for his 60th birthday party arrived. The card was formal, printed on cream paper with gold lettering. My mother's handwriting was on the back, asking me to please come. I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for days. 10 years of success had passed without my father seeing any of it. If I went, I could keep playing my part, or I could finally tell the truth. When the evening came, I decided there would be no more pretending. I drove my own car, a deep blue luxury sedan that caught the light under the street lamps. As I turned onto their road, the houses seemed smaller than I remembered, though the lawns were still trimmed and the driveways swept clean. Pulling into my parents' driveway, I saw the same front porch I'd walked up countless times, but this time I carried a bottle of champagne that cost more than my first month's rent in New York. My mother opened the door and hugged me like she meant it. Her eyes traveled over my suit jacket, lingering for a moment on the fabric. "You look wonderful," she said, glancing past me toward the driveway. "Is that a rental?" I shook my head. "No, it's mine." She didn't have time to respond before my father appeared in the hall, checked his watch, and said, "Most of the guests will be here at 7. The living room was just as it had been, same furniture, same photographs, same trophy shelf lined with Daniel's awards. My own high school economics competition certificate had never made it there. Daniel arrived not long after with his wife Laura, and though our history was complicated, his smile was easy. "The New York life suits you," he said, giving me a quick hug. My father pulled him into a conversation about a recent case, leaving me to talk with Laura about their children. As more guests arrived, my father settled into his role as host, telling stories of Daniel's latest legal victory. I was speaking with an old neighbor when the doorbell rang again. Professor Wilson, one of my father's longtime colleagues, walked in with his wife and their son James. My mother began introducing us, but James stopped when she said my name. "Claire Whitman, from Whitman Capital." His voice carried enough surprise to make the room quiet. "Yes," I said, unsure where this was going. "I just read your profile in Forbes," he said, smiling. "You're the one who revolutionized predictive investment strategies. Your firm's returns are legendary." My father's brow furrowed, but James was already pulling out his phone to show the article. There I was on the screen, standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange. "See, it's her." My mother's hand went to her mouth. "You own an investment company." "I do," I said. "We manage just over $1 billion in assets now." Daniel stepped forward, looking more surprised than anyone. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" My father cleared his throat. "Those magazines like to exaggerate. They make celebrities out of people." But James kept talking, explaining that the returns were real, that even my father's retirement fund manager had tried to get on my client list. Dinner was called not long after, but the air at the table felt different. My father asked me to explain more about my work, his voice carrying that familiar edge of control. I looked around at the people gathered, family, colleagues, neighbors, and felt years of silence pressing in. "We manage over $1 billion, I said evenly. "My personal net worth is about $15 million. I own a condo in Manhattan and sit on 3 industry boards. I was named one of the most influential people in finance under 40 last year." The table went still. My father asked why I would hide that from my family. I told him I hadn't hidden anything no one had asked. His eyes darkened, but my mother reached for my hand. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never looked past what you decided I was capable of when I was 12 years old. My father denied ever saying I'd never be the bright one, but my mother didn't let him. You said it at dinner after she was rejected from your alma mater," she told him. I stood then, the noise of my own heartbeat in my ears. I should go. This was a mistake. I was almost to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel's voice broke the quiet. I didn't know, he said, leaning on the open door. "But I do know how badly Dad's hurt you." I told him it didn't matter, but he shook his head. "It does, and you just proved it does by telling the truth in there." He hesitated before adding, "Can I tell you something? I've always been jealous of you." I stared at him, not sure I'd heard right. He explained that he'd been living the life Dad planned for him since he was a boy, and he hated corporate law. "You got away," he said simply. We stood there for a long moment, the porch light casting a pale circle on the driveway. Finally, I said, "Let's go back inside." When Daniel and I stepped back into the house, the laughter from earlier was gone. A few guests had already left, and the rest sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. My father stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, while my mother sat on the sofa, a folded napkin clutched in her hand. Daniel and I took seats across from them, the quiet stretching, until my father finally spoke. "I don't understand why you would keep this from us," he said, his voice measured. "Were you trying to embarrass me? Make me look foolish in front of my friends?" "No," I said, keeping my tone even. "I was protecting myself from exactly what happened tonight, dismissal and disbelief." "I never dismissed your achievements," he said quickly. I looked at him steadily. "When I won the economics competition in high school, you missed it to attend Daniel's debate. When I graduated with honors, you called them state school honors. When I took my first job in New York, you called it paper pushing." Daniel shifted forward in his chair. "She's right, Dad. You've always measured us by the same narrow definition of success. For me, that meant constant pressure to match your path exactly. For Claire, it meant being told she'd never measure up." My father's mouth opened as if to argue, but my mother's voice cut in. "You did say that she told him quietly. After she was rejected by your alma mater, you said she'd never be the bright one. I sat there and didn't say a word, and I regret that more than anything." Her admission seemed to stop my father in place. He looked from her to me, his expression shifting, though it was hard to tell if it was anger, surprise, or something else. My mother continued, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "I let you define success so narrowly that neither of our children had room to simply be themselves. I gave up my own career to support yours, and then I stood by while you made Claire feel small and pushed Daniel into a life that wasn't his choice." My father slowly lowered himself into the armchair, his posture less rigid now. "I pushed because I wanted you both to succeed," he said after a moment. I shook my head. "You pushed because you wanted us to succeed in ways that validated your own choices. My success didn't come from your pushing. It came when I stopped trying to be what you wanted and became who I am." I reached into my purse and took out my phone, pulling up Whitman Capital's website. I handed it to him, letting him scroll through the press coverage, performance records, and industry awards. "This is what I've built over the past 10 years. You called it that stock thing in New York. These are billion-dollar hedge funds, Fortune 500 companies, and entrepreneurs who trust my judgment." For the first time, my father's expression changed in a way I hadn't seen before. The certainty in his eyes faltered, replaced by something quieter. "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't ask," I replied. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, there's something you should know from me, too. I hate being a corporate lawyer. I've hated it for years. I've been offered a teaching position at the law school, and I'm going to take it." My father turned toward him. "But your partnership track?" "It's making me miserable," Daniel said firmly. "Just like your expectations made Claire miserable for years." My mother stood walking to stand between us. She took each of our hands in hers. "Thomas, we all need to be honest now. You and I need to go to therapy, both as a couple and as parents. We need to learn how to support their actual dreams, not the ones we imagined for them." My father looked at the three of us, my mother, my brother, and me standing together. His eyes moved from one face to the next, and for the first time that night, I saw something that looked like weariness instead of resistance. "I never meant to hurt either of you," he said slowly. "I thought I was doing what was best." "You thought you knew better than anyone else," my mother said gently. "But you were wrong. Look at what Claire has built without your approval. Look at how unhappy Daniel has been trying to live up to your standard. He hesitated, then asked, "Can we start over? Can we build something different from here?" I took a breath. Not start over. But we can start from here with the truth, clear boundaries, and you seeing who I am, not who you decided I was. He nodded once. I'd like that. We moved back to the dining room, the food on the table cooled, and the candles nearly burned down. My mother reheated the dishes while Daniel opened another bottle of wine. The conversation shifted slowly at first, then with more ease. My father began asking me questions, real ones about my work, my approach, and my methods. It's unconventional, he said, after I explained how I blend market data with cultural analysis. But it clearly works. You've always noticed things other people overlook. It was a small acknowledgement years too late, but it felt like the first step towards something different. I raised my glass. To new beginnings. He met my eyes. To the daughter I didn't see clearly for too long. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough to leave the table believing the door had opened to something better. The weeks after my father's birthday passed in a strange quiet. We spoke a few times on the phone, always keeping the conversations polite and brief. Daniel called more often, checking in to tell me he had accepted the teaching position at the law school and was preparing to leave his firm. My mother sent a few short emails with updates about her art studio, saying she had reopened it and was teaching classes again at the community center. It was progress, even if it was slow. Then, one Saturday morning, my mother called and asked if I would come home for the weekend. "We've been talking," she said, "and we think it might help to meet with someone together." She explained that she and my father had found a family therapist in Boston who came highly recommended. It wasn't something I'd expected, but I agreed. The following Friday, I drove to the small brick office building where the sessions were held. The waiting room smelled faintly of lavender, and soft instrumental music played from a corner speaker. Dr. Harris, a calm woman in her early 60s, greeted us and led us into her office where 4 chairs were arranged in a circle. The first session was awkward. My father sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap, while my mother spoke about wanting to rebuild trust. Dr. Harris asked us to share what we hoped to gain. I said I wanted open, respectful communication. Daniel said he wanted room to make choices without fear of losing approval. My father hesitated, then admitted he wanted to understand where he had gone wrong. By the second session, he began speaking about his own childhood, how his father had demanded perfection and withheld praise unless he excelled. "I became the very thing I hated," he said, his voice catching. "I measured you against impossible standards because that was all I knew." Hearing that didn't erase the years of dismissal, but it explained more than I expected. My mother also took responsibility, saying she had enabled the favoritism by staying silent. By not speaking up, I became part of the problem, she told us. "I should have defended you both." Outside of those sessions, changes began to take shape. Daniel seemed lighter every time we met. He talked about lesson planning and how much he enjoyed being on campus without the constant pressure of billable hours. My mother started showing me pictures of her students' paintings, clearly proud of the work she was doing again. For me, the change was quieter. I kept the boundaries we'd set, limiting visits and calls to what felt comfortable. At Whitman Capital, I launched a mentorship program for young women in finance, pairing them with experienced professionals who could help them navigate the industry. I also created a scholarship at State University for students who showed market insight but didn't fit the usual academic mold. 3 months after therapy began, my father surprised me by attending an awards ceremony where I was being recognized for my firm's performance. When I walked on stage, I saw him stand and applaud, the expression on his face different from the polite smiles of the past. Later, he told me the event had given him a better sense of the scale of my work. "It's more than I realized," he admitted quietly. The following month, I attended my mother's first art showing in 20 years. She had arranged the canvases in a small gallery downtown, the walls alive with color and movement. One piece, a large abstract in deep blues and golds, caught my attention immediately. She told me she had named it Renaissance. I bought it on the spot for my office conference room. Over time, our family conversations began to feel less like performances and more like real exchanges. My father started asking about my projects without the skeptical tone I'd grown used to. Daniel called to tell me when one of his students had a breakthrough in class. My mother invited me to guest speak at her community art program about running a creative business. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old habits resurfaced, a too-sharp comment, a glance that carried judgment, but now there was space to address it. Therapy gave us the language to name those moments instead of letting them fester. One afternoon, about 6 months after that first tense session, my father called me directly. "I'd like to host a dinner," he said, "just the 4 of us. No guests, no distractions. I think we need that." We set it for the following weekend. As I drove to Wellesley that night, I realized it was the first time in years I wasn't dreading walking through their front door. When I arrived, the table was set with simple white plates and candles and glass holders. My mother had made roast chicken, and the smell filled the kitchen. We sat down, and my father raised his glass. "To honesty," he said, "and to moving forward." It was a short toast, but it felt genuine. We spent the evening talking about small things: Daniel's classes, my latest client project, my mother's new art series, but beneath it all was a sense that the ground had shifted. As I left that night, my father walked me to my car. He didn't say much, just wished me a safe drive. But when I glanced back before starting the engine, he was still standing in the driveway watching until I pulled away. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, one that felt real enough to build on. 2 weeks after that quiet family dinner, I received an email from my father with the subject line, "Would you have lunch with me?" It was brief, just a few lines suggesting a cafe near the university. I hesitated before replying, but agreed. When I arrived, he was already seated by the window, a mug of coffee in front of him. We exchanged the usual greetings, and for a while we spoke about small things: the weather, Daniel's lectures, my mother's art class, enrollment. Then he shifted in his chair and said, "I've been reading about your industry, trying to understand it better." He pulled a folded clipping from his jacket pocket, an article about emerging market strategies. "This makes more sense now after what you explained at dinner," he said. "It's impressive." His tone was careful, but it was the first time I'd heard him acknowledge my work without a trace of doubt. Over the next hour, we discussed market shifts, technology adoption, and the unpredictable ways people influence the economy. He asked questions instead of challenging my answers, and by the time we left, the conversation felt less like a debate and more like an exchange between equals. In the weeks that followed, we met twice more, once for coffee and once for a walk through the public gardens. The topics varied, sometimes business, sometimes family history, but each meeting seemed to chip away at the old dynamic. My father began speaking more about his own father, sharing stories I hadn't heard before. I could see how those years had shaped him, even in ways he hadn't realized. Meanwhile, Daniel settled into his teaching position. We met for lunch one afternoon near his campus, and he looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. "I had a student today who argued with me for 15 minutes, he said with a grin, and I loved every second of it. At Whitman Capital, the mentorship program gained momentum. The young analysts I worked with brought fresh energy to the office, and their progress reminded me why I'd started it. One of them, a sharp graduate named Mia Collins, asked if I'd be willing to speak at a Women in Business event downtown. I accepted, though I didn't expect who would be in the audience. On the night of the event, I spotted my mother and father seated together near the back. My mother waved. My father simply nodded. Afterward, they waited while I spoke to attendees, and when the room had cleared, my father said quietly, "You were good up there. Confident. Clear." It was another small step, but one I noted. Not every interaction was smooth. There were moments when he slipped back into old patterns, questioning a decision I'd made or offering unsolicited advice. But now, when that happened, I was able to point it out without the conversation shutting down completely. It was a new kind of balance, not perfect, but functional. One Sunday afternoon, my mother called and asked if I could come by for dinner. When I arrived, the table was already set, and she was stirring a pot on the stove. My father joined us in the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine. "We'd like to invite you to something," he said. He handed me a card for a university fundraiser where he was scheduled to speak. "I'd like you to come as my guest. And, if you're willing, I'd like to introduce you properly." The evening of the fundraiser, the banquet hall was filled with faculty, alumni, and donors. My father stood at the podium speaking about the importance of adapting education for the next generation. Then, near the end, he paused and said, "We learn not just from books and colleagues, but from the people around us, including family. My daughter Claire has built a company that is redefining how we understand market behavior. Her work combines economic principles with social insight in ways that have taught me a great deal. Please join me in welcoming her tonight." Applause followed, and though it was brief, it was genuine. Afterward, several guests approached me with questions about my work. My father stayed nearby listening without interrupting, and when the evening ended, he walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wanted them to know who you really are." Driving home that night, the city lights flickering past, I realized how far we'd come since that tense birthday dinner. But there was still one more step, a conversation we hadn't had yet, one that could finally put the past into perspective. A few weeks after the fundraiser, my father called and asked if I could stop by the house on a Sunday afternoon. His voice was steady, but there was a pause before he added, "There's something I'd like to say to you in person." When I arrived, my mother was in the kitchen preparing tea. She greeted me with a smile and told me my father was waiting in the living room. He stood when I entered, gesturing for me to sit across from him. The sunlight through the curtains caught the gray in his hair, and for a moment he seemed older than his 60 years. "I've been thinking a lot since that night at the university," he began. "Seeing you there, hearing the way people spoke about your work. I realized how much I've missed by not asking, by not seeing you for who you are." He shifted forward in his chair. "I'm proud of you, Claire. Not just for the success, but for having the courage to build your own life when I made it hard for you to do that." It was the first time I had ever heard him say those words without any qualifiers. I thanked him, and for a while we sat quietly, letting the weight of the moment settle. My mother joined us, setting the tea on the table. "We've all been learning," she said softly, "and I think we're finally moving in the right direction." Over the next month, our family found a new rhythm. Sunday dinners became more frequent, though not every week. Daniel often joined, bringing stories from his classes, the student who had challenged him on a point of constitutional law, the young woman who had told him she wanted to teach because of his example. My father listened, asking questions without turning them into lectures. At Whitman Capital, I kept busy with client meetings and strategy sessions. The mentorship program had its first class of graduates, several of whom were already making notable moves in the industry. One evening as I was leaving the office, I received a message from Daniel. "We should plan something for Mom's art show next month. She deserves a real celebration." We decided to surprise her with a family portrait commission, something different from the formal photographs of our childhood. I contacted a Boston-based artist whose work combined realism with symbolic touches. After a few planning calls, she suggested including elements that represented each of us: my mother, with her paintbrushes, my father with a stack of his published work, Daniel in an open classroom, and me with the city skyline behind my desk. On the night of the unveiling, the portrait stood on an easel in the gallery covered by a white cloth. My mother gasped when she saw it, her hand going to her mouth. "You even captured the light in my studio," she said, tracing the painted window in her section. My father studied the canvas for a long time before nodding once, his expression unreadable but not closed off. The portrait found its place in the living room, replacing the old display of trophies and certificates. It became a quiet reminder of how far we had come, not erasing the past, but adding something new. A few days later, my father called again, this time with an unusual request. "There's a lecture series at the university next month," he said. "They've asked me to speak, and I'd like you to join me on stage." We'd present together two perspectives on economics side by side. I agreed, and in the weeks that followed, we exchanged outlines and ideas. For the first time, collaboration felt natural between us. On the evening of the lecture, we stood at the podium together. He spoke about traditional economic models, and I followed with insights on how social patterns influence financial markets. The audience responded warmly, and as we left the stage, my father turned to me. "You've expanded the way I think about this subject," he said quietly. "I'm grateful for that." It was a simple statement, but it carried more meaning than I could put into words. The road to this point had been long, but moments like this showed me the change was real. As we walked out into the cool night air, I realized there was one more conversation waiting, one that would close the distance between us for good, and I knew exactly when and where it needed to happen. A week after the lecture, I invited my parents and Daniel to my condo in Manhattan. They had never been there before, and as they stepped into the open living room with its view of Central Park, I could see them taking it in quietly. My mother wandered toward the windows, smiling at the city's skyline. My father lingered by the bookshelf, his eyes scanning the framed articles and awards that lined the shelves. I had prepared dinner myself, nothing elaborate, just roasted salmon, vegetables, and fresh bread from the market downstairs. We ate at the small table near the windows, the city lights stretching into the distance. Conversation moved easily from Daniel's students to my mother's latest gallery opening. There was no edge, no careful choosing of words. When the plates were cleared, my father stayed at the table, while the others moved to the living room. He rested his hands on the polished surface, looking at me across the quiet. "I should have told you sooner," he said, "but I'm telling you now I am proud of you, Claire. Not for the money or the headlines, but for being brave enough to follow your own path even when I doubted you." The words landed gently, without the sting of the past. I thanked him, and for the first time, I believed we could leave the old version of our family behind. The harm couldn't be undone, but it no longer had to define us. In the months that followed, our relationships took on a steadier shape. Sunday dinners became a tradition we all looked forward to. The portrait in my parents' living room remained a constant reminder that we were choosing to see each other fully now. Daniel thrived in his teaching role, my mother continued to paint, and my father found ways to ask about my work without comparison or skepticism. Looking back, I realized the change had never been about one dramatic moment, but a series of choices, mine to stand in my truth, theirs to listen, and all of us to keep trying even when it was uncomfortable. The lesson for me was simple. No one else can decide your worth. You define it in the way you live, the boundaries you hold, and the courage you bring to each day. And sometimes standing firm in that truth can open the door for others to change too. If you've ever had to reclaim your place in your own story, I hope you'll share it. And if this journey has stayed with you, I'm glad you were here to hear it.